Welcome to Food Forests, building a food producing ecosystem. I'm Dean Gunderson, the Director of Education here at Seed St. Louis. And my other hat, one of my other hats at Seed St. Louis, is I run our orchard program. So I do all of the fruit trees, all of that. And so, yeah, that's why I'm talking about a lot of trees, nut producing, fruit producing things, which you do in our orchard program. And so here we go. So first, if you've been to any of my classes, you know my first slide is just trying to define things. So what is a food forest? I'm also going to say here that you're going to sometimes hear me say forest garden. That's the same thing, at least when I'm using it. Those two terms are interchangeable. So if I say food forest, forest garden, I'm talking about the same thing. So just want to make sure that's clear. But basically, a food forest is an agro ecosystem that integrates woody plants, perennials, and annuals in a way that emulates a forest ecosystem. So that's a whole lot of fancy stuff. And we'll kind of break that part in the next couple slides. But one of the things that I really want to emphasize here, because it is one of the areas that a lot of times people get confused about, and it's an area that can cause a lot of problems if you're trying to plant a food forest, is that it is generally not an emulation of a closed canopy forest, which is what most people think about when you hear the word forest. Like when you think, the forest or the woods, and you go in and it's like very shady, all the ground cover is shade tolerant stuff. There's not a lot of light. That is not what a food forest is. There is not a lot of stuff that is going to grow in that full shade environment. Food forest is a little different, at least in like the St. Louis area, the Midwest area. In the tropics, it is more closed. But here, it's not what you're thinking about when you think of a forest. It's actually something a little different. So then, like, kind of what is an agro ecosystem? We use that term in the last slide there. So an agro ecosystem is basically, it's an ecosystem, but it's just like an agricultural ecosystem, because anything with plants, anything that's out living in the environment is a type of ecosystem. So an agro ecosystem is just an ecosystem, organisms that have an agricultural purpose. So, the definition of an ecosystem is the complex of living organisms, their physical environment, and their interrelationships in a particular unit of space. So that can be something like a prairie, a desert, a savanna, a deciduous forest, or it could be an orchard or a field or pasture, or all of those things are ecosystems. They are just ecosystems that we have altered or created to produce food, for agricultural purposes. So all outdoor farming, so this does not include, hydroponics and aquaponics, but all outdoor farming is an emulation of a natural ecosystem. And it's generally a very simplified emulation. So, when we think about, farming, it's usually pretty simple. Even your garden is pretty simple compared to like a natural ecosystem. And this simplification we do so that we can more easily manage it. But it is also one of the primary reasons that these systems need so much intervention to survive. So intervention in the form of like weeding or spraying for pests or doing, all those different things. The fact that we are simplifying the environment, we're taking out, some of those plants that maybe were helping suppress disease, or, getting rid of the food that was keeping the bee alive that was pollinating the plant. Like when we simplify these things, when we take things out that would normally be there, there's then holes kind of in that ecosystem. And also, since we want what we want, generally humans are we are acting as a natural disturbance to arrest plant succession at the point we want our agro ecosystem at. So we'll talk about what plant succession is, but we are generally the disturbance. So, if you have, I'll jump here just for the graphic. So, if you have there no, sorry. I'll stick with what I was going with. So ecosystem succession. So an ecosystem, people think about like a forest, a desert, or whatever, like they're not static. They don't stay exactly the same all the time. They change over time. And that changing is called succession. So disturbances are things that set the succession clock back or prevent it from progressing. So a disturbance is something like fire, a landslide, a flood, a massive storm, a herd of grazing animals, or logging, mowing, or tillage if you're the human disturbance, or weeding, even, pulling things out. So these are all things that kill plants, or set plants back, which prevents the ecosystem from progressing or continuing with succession. So what we're talking about with succession is, if you have a fire that comes in and like burns the whole forest down, the next year it's not, oh, magically a forest again. It's usually the fire makes it, pretty bare. And so usually in the first year, you're going to see a lot of annual weeds that grow. And then the next year or two, you're going to start seeing some like perennial weeds, and then maybe some like blackberries or raspberries. And then you're going to start seeing some shrubs or some really fast growing trees. And then eventually you're going to start seeing some of those trees, and they're going to grow and they're going to shade out all of that stuff underneath them. And it's going to kind of turn into a forest. So it goes through kind of these relatively predictable stages, from kind of annual weedy plants to perennial plants and grasses, and then kind of shrubs and like fast growing trees will kind of start growing in this grassy area. And then you'll start having, kind of short lived trees. And then eventually you'll have, big, long lived trees. Now, this is not the same everywhere, but here, that's pretty much the pattern. Like if you have, a vacant lot, let's say, even if you're in the city, you can see this. You have a vacant lot and somebody stops mowing it, you pretty quickly start seeing large perennial weedy things. And then you start seeing like little trees growing, maybe some blackberries, and then you'll start seeing bigger trees and, all that different stuff. Like this is a thing that happens. Not everything will turn into a forest. If you go out into Western Nebraska, it's not going to turn into a forest if you leave it there eventually, but you are going to get, it's not going to stay annuals forever. It's going to become perennials and then kind of, maybe some shrubby things. So like I said, all of our farming systems outside are emulating some ecosystem. So somewhere in this succession. And for the most part, our annual gardens and all of the annual crops we grow, which is virtually everything we eat, is an emulation of a weedscape. It's an emulation of the very first things that grow after a catastrophic event like a fire, landslide, flood, windstorm. Like that is how we grow our food. We cause what is the equivalent of a catastrophic event. We strip the land bare, and then we plant weeds. Like that's why there's so many weeds in our annual gardens, is because our annual crops are also weeds. They're just weeds that we domesticated and like the food of. But biologically, they're mostly weeds. So it's an emulation of kind of a weedscape or, annual grasses. And weeds aren't meant to be there forever. They are the first stop. The weeds grow really fast to cover the soil, and then the perennial plants and grasses come in and take over. Weeds cannot maintain an ecosystem long term. They cannot, build soil, do those things generally. I mean, there are ways that we can make that happen, but that's why annual growing usually requires so many inputs. It requires, compost or fertilizers, or, there's lots of erosion. There's things like that because those annuals really biologically are not designed to be there year after year after year after year. They're usually there for 1 year, maybe 2 or 3 years. But even after the first year, you're going to start usually seeing some perennials coming in and taking over. But even if you go, if you go beyond to kind of take that kind of same thought experiment. So perennial vegetables, when we talk about like perennial vegetables, or if you know about perennial vegetables, that is kind of the emulation of this ecosystem. It's those kind of perennial plants and grasses. Pastures are emulations of grasslands. So again, kind of this area kind of transitioning into woody pioneers sometimes, or just, prairies, kind of an emulation of like a prairie kind of grassland is what our pastures are. When we have like kind of orchards that are growing things like cane fruit, so blackberries, raspberries, or fruiting shrubs, so like blueberries, bush cherries, honeyberries, currants, gooseberries. Those are kind of emulations of shrublands. So kind of this early kind of woody time. Vineyards are also kind of an emulation of the same time. Wild grapes grow like crazy in this kind of stage of ecosystem. Orchards kind of emulate woodlands, so widely spaced trees. Again, not like closed canopies. If you go to an orchard, they're not smashed up against each other. They have space between them. And then timberlands, like timber plantations where they're growing for lumber, that's really more an emulation of like what a forest is. So what is a food forest? You know, I go through all of this. What's the point here? So a food forest then is an emulation of this kind of sweet spot where there are annuals, there's perennial herbaceous plants, and there's woodies, kind of all at the same time. And this is a weird kind of spot in succession that most of us are not super familiar with. But this would be the area that would be the early successional forest through what's kind of like a savanna. So savanna is where you have, big, or you can have some big mature trees, but there's still lots of sun coming through. It's not a dense closed canopy. And because there's still lots of sun coming through, you're also getting shrubs and herbaceous things and even grasses, things like that growing. And this is the ecosystem, this kind of early successional through savanna kind of stage. And that would be, if it'll let me go back here. So that would be kind of right in here. So kind of this early pioneer trees kind of in here through, kind of straddles this border. It's kind of what we're talking about. So this is the ecosystem where basically all of our fruit crops originally came from, like all of them. Like there's almost none that I honestly can't think of a single one that this isn't where they naturally grow, is that type of ecosystem. So, the apples are not growing in a big closed canopy forest. Like if you go to a state park and hike around in the woods, that is not where apples are from. And it's unique blend of height. So having some really big, tall trees, but also them being far enough apart that you're getting sun all the way down to the ground, that kind of three-dimensional growth, but also sun exposure all the way around, allows for incredibly high plant production. Just, a lot of biomass, a lot of stuff growing in that space. And for the most part, we aren't familiar with this ecosystem because early successional forests are usually what people call weedy forests, and they're usually bulldozed or at least not looked upon kindly. And savannas were pretty much completely obliterated. We talk about how the prairies have been lost, and they have, but there's about 4% of the original prairie left. It's estimated that less than 0.02% of the oak savanna exists. And that's actually what most of the area, kind of eastern Missouri, like when we think about prairie, a lot of that area was actually savanna. It's just the savannas generally were either turned into shaded pastures because there were these big trees, and then they would just destroy the stuff below the trees and then leave the trees for shade, or they cut the trees down and turned it into farmland or an open pasture. And their diversity, because they have all these different layers, all these different things going on, makes them hard to manage, which is another reason why we generally got rid of them, because they're not simple and easy to manage. They're pretty complicated. And so when there's not a lot of people, when you're dealing with a large space, it's a lot of work. And so it's easier to deal with just like a grassland, a forest, like where there's fewer things that you're dealing with. But that same diversity that can make them difficult to manage is also what makes them a great ecosystem to emulate if your goal is growing your own food. Which is where you want kind of a small amount of a lot of different things, because you can pack a lot of stuff in a relatively small space, a lot of diversity in a relatively small space. And this is why food forests are very old systems that exist currently or did exist everywhere on the planet where woody plants can grow. And people are growing for their own consumption. They pretty much are lost when commercial agriculture takes over because it's not very labor efficient. If you're like looking to produce one or two crops, a large amount to sell, not efficient for that. But if you're trying to grow your own food, they're pretty efficient. So when people are like growing their own food for their own consumption, food forests pretty much existed everywhere. They are still very common throughout the tropics, which is where the permaculture movement got the idea for food forests. They took that from the tropics. Um, However, temperate areas, which is where we live, also have a long tradition. They were just for the most part kind of wiped out over the last couple hundred years, or even further back. The Romans didn't really like them. The Romans did big plantation systems. They're not efficient for that, and so they did used to exist in Europe. Most of the forests in the United States, you could argue, were actually kind of food forests that were designed by or were managed by the indigenous people, which is why you hear stuff like, oh, it's an oak hickory forest, but whenever you just like let an area grow back to woods, it's not oaks and hickories, it's maples and all these other things. And part of that is because they were managed, they were made oak hickory forests to some degree. But Europe does have a long tradition of food forests, and there's a really great blog post out there, article. It's been published by a lot of different people called "The Lost Forest Gardens of Europe." If you want to learn about some of the European history of food forests as well, so it can be done in our climate for sure. So how do you do that? How do you actually make these food forests? So you kind of look at that ecosystem, or you look at your space and you keep what is useful. So if you've got like kind of a woody area or something, or you've got stuff already planted in your yard, you can kind of mark, oh, this is useful or this is helpful, keep those things, and then you can kind of replace the rest with things that have the same kind of place in the ecosystem. So one way people think about it, and especially if you're designing from scratch, if you've just got like a grassy lawn and you want to plant stuff, is to kind of break this ecosystem down into between 7 and 9 layers, depending on your kind of your specific area. So the 7, like kind of everyone agrees on the 7, and the last 2 are kind of some additional ones that you can do. But that would be canopy, and this little graphic over here from Temperate Climate Permaculture kind of shows you. So there's canopy, so those are the big tall trees. There's subcanopy, so these would be kind of the understory trees in a forest, or kind of just those like shorter trees. There's the shrubs. There's the herbaceous layer, so these are the non-woody things that are going to die down to the ground but then come back every year. There's ground cover, so these are the things that creep around on the ground and cover it. There's the underground layer, so these would be things like root crops. There's the vertical and climber layer, the things that want to grow up. And then the last 2, there's aquatic or wetland layer. So this is one that, usually in urban areas, we don't have a lot of wetlands in our yards, but it is something that you can add, and we're going to talk about that. And then there's the fungal layer, which is like mushrooms and stuff that also work really well in these ecosystems. And we're gonna talk about all of those layers individually. So if you're going to design a space, design a food forest or a forest garden, what you're going to need to do kind of first, or at least what I would recommend first, is to select the plants to fill all those layers. So, kind of figure out what will grow well here, what are your options, and then from that list, pick the ones that you're excited about. And we're going to go through some of those lists, but it's not an exhaustive list. There's definitely other stuff out there. But I'm gonna go through today the ones that I have experience with and that I think are worth growing. There's a lot of other stuff out there that people talk about that like I've grown and I'm like, this was not good, or like the yields were pathetic, or something like that. So there are lots of other things out there, but I'm going to talk about the ones that I'm like, I grew this, it grew well, and it was definitely worth it. But it is my opinion. So there's definitely other stuff out there. So keep that in mind as we go through today. But you're going to want to pick stuff kind of from each of those layers. If there's of all the layers that you're actually going to use. So, sometimes those, all those layers might not make sense. So if you don't have a wet area, or you don't want to deal with water, then you probably don't need to pick stuff from the aquatic layer. If you have a relatively small space, a lot of times people will skip that first layer, the canopy layer, because they don't have space to be growing pecans or chestnuts or big giant trees. Sometimes people will even skip the first two layers. If they've got a really small space, the biggest thing they have might be a shrub, and that's fine. So kind of figure out what it is you have space for, and then pick stuff for all those layers that you are actually going to implement. And then it's really helpful to study each plant. And it doesn't need to be like real in depth, but just generally figure out what do these plants need. Do they need full sun? Do they need some shade? Do they like wet soils? Do they like dry soils? And what can't it tolerate? So just as an example, if you're like, I really want to do cherries cannot tolerate wet soils, and so if all you have is wet soils, well, then cherries are not going to be for you. And so kind of finding those things out can kind of help you narrow down your list, make you kind of focus in on what is actually going to be the most effective for you. And I'll talk about some of those quirks that are of note as we go through, but it's also useful to get some books, do a Google, kind of look into some of those things on your own as well, or talk to other people who have grown them if you know anyone around who has grown them. And then layout is key. You want to integrate these layers. That's what makes it a food forest and not just an orchard next to a vineyard, next to an asparagus patch. So integrating these layers and stacking them is really critical. So plant shorter trees and shrubs under taller trees. So, instead of having like big tree and then little tree, have big tree and little tree, kind of like tuck them in a little bit. Plant your herbaceous things, your kind of herbaceous layer under and around your trees, your shrubs, your small trees, whatever it can kind of fit in. Plant ground covers or creeping vines around everything, have them as the ground cover. That's what they're for. And you can train vines up trees or up poles that are leaning against trees, something like that. Use that vertical space. And another critical thing, that is another spot where people tend to get into trouble, because again, we're not trying to create a closed canopy. So if you look up an apple and the apple says you space them 15 feet apart. Well, if you then plant two apples 15 feet apart, that means when they're mature, they're going to be touching each other, which means there's no sun getting below them, which means those shrubs, those herbaceous layer, that ground cover is not going to be happy. So a general rule of thumb is you want to plant things at least 1.5 times the recommended spacing. So if it says that apple tree should be 15 feet apart, you should be spacing it at least 23 feet apart, so that there's enough space in between them, even when they're big, that the sun can come through and hit those shrubs and those herbaceous layers and those ground covers and all those other good things that you have growing underneath them. And that goes for everything in all of your layers, except the stuff on the very bottom. If you're not going to have anything planted underneath something, then yeah, space it the standard spacing. But you want to be about 1.5 times the standard spacing or further. You can definitely go further, but you don't want to go much closer than 1.5 times unless there's nothing that you're going to be planting further below it. Or if the thing that you're planting below it like wants deep shade, which there's a few things, but not many that will do that. Another critical thing is considering orientation. This can really help you get stuff growing well underneath other things. So the south side of plants is going to get the most sun. The sun is in the southern sky, even at the solstice, which we're coming up on here in a week or two. Even at that point, when the sun is highest overhead, it is not directly overhead. It is still slightly to the south. Because we're north of the equator and we're far enough north that the sun is never directly overhead. It's always in the southern sky. And so on the south side of a tree, a shrub, is where you're going to get the most sun. So, if you've got a tree and you need something and you have something that wants a lot of sun, plant it on the south side. The east side is going to get sun in the morning, and that's going to be cooler sun. It's going to get light and it's going to be cooler. The west side of things is going to get sun in the afternoon, and so it's going to be hot. So it's going to be a hot sun. And then the north side is going to get shade most of the time, almost all of the time. So anything that you're wanting to plant underneath something that is producing fruit or nuts generally should be on the south side of anything above it, because that's where it's going to get the most light. And fruiting things need a lot of light. It's a lot of energy to produce babies, which is what fruit are. So you're generally going to want them on the southern side if you're planting them underneath something. There are a few exceptions. Ribes fruits, so those would be currants, gooseberries, and josta berries, as well as honeyberries, do best on the east side. So those are fruit producers, but they can't take our heat. And so planting on the east side, where they're going to get morning sun when it's cool and then be shaded during the hottest part of the year or hottest part of the day, is where they are really going to thrive. And that's what this picture is here. So this is a pear that I have planted out in my garden area. And this is actually south over here. So I have an aronia berry here that's in full sun, and I have this that's on the east, kind of the northeast side of this pear. And this is in early afternoon, and you can see this is nice and shaded. So in the morning, this was getting sun, but in the afternoon now, when it's hot, this is getting shade, and it's pretty happy. Whereas I planted honeyberries on the south side before I learned this, and they just burnt up. Like by this time of year, they looked dead. All the leaves just fell off. And then things like figs actually like it really hot. So they do good on kind of the southwest side is where they do the best, because that's the hottest, brightest spot. So, you know, different fruiting things like different things. And then kind of those other spaces, more the northern side of your plants, is where you're going to put your vegetables, your vegetative things, because they don't need as much sun. Difficult spots, so areas where you're like, oh, I don't know where, like, I don't know what food producing thing is gonna work here, is also a great area to plant things that are not necessarily for food. Things that are supporting your beneficial insects, your beneficial birds, your beneficial bats, your, you know, all those other ecosystem things that you want. And so a word on non-food producers. Your food forest doesn't need to be, and probably shouldn't be, all food producing things. If you're wanting this to be a food forest, like a forest garden, an ecosystem, you know, a more self-maintaining thing, then you're also going to want to be providing habitat for the other things that are going to help you do that. And also some areas, it's just going to be really hard to make an edible thing work in that spot. And so those are really good areas to plant these other beneficial plants. So a general rule of thumb, if you're wanting to plant for, you know, beneficial insects, birds, whatever, is aim for a continuous bloom. So have something blooming as many of the 52 weeks out of the year as possible. You know, at least one thing blooming every week that you are able to make that work. You know, you're not going to have something blooming literally every week, but you can get pretty close. And you generally want to focus on natives, because we want to support these native insects and birds and stuff like that. Those are the ones that are going to do the most benefit for you. And they have adapted with the native plants. And so mostly natives. And that should say focus on small flowered, not slowered. So small flowered ones are also the most versatile in terms of what can use them. So the big showy flowers are really pretty, but it's hard for predatory and parasitic insects to get pollen and nectar from those. They do a lot better with little tiny flowers. So, you know, yarrow is an example. So this, you know, looks like, oh, it's one big flower, but it's actually like 100 little itty bitty ones. So this is like perfect for beneficial insects. They love this, and bees can also use these flowers. So they're very versatile. And this is just a list of some natives that we like that kind of have long blooms, are useful, and some of them bloom at weird times. Ones that I really like to, a couple that I really like to highlight are the witch hazels. We have 2 native witch hazels, and they're really cool. They're very underappreciated in my opinion. And I can never remember which is which, but one blooms November to December, and the other one blooms January to February. So these are ones that are literally blooming in the middle of winter when there's not going to be a lot else blooming. and they're blooming kind of in that window where they're blooming at that time of year where it's common for us to have warm days or a warm couple days. And so if you get native insects that wake up during that time, those witch hazels have flowers so that they can get food and get back to sleep. Whereas if there is no food during those times, what can happen sometimes is those native insects wake up, they fly around, they realize, oh, I should not have woken up, and they don't have enough food, and they starve to death before they can kind of get back into hibernation. They're pretty. This is a picture I took at the botanical gardens in February. You can see this is snow on the ground in the background. They bloom. They're gorgeous. They're native. And they can take a lot of shade, so they're a good one that you can kind of stick in shadier areas in your forest garden. And then these are just some other natives that are nice, long blooming, small flowered, good to have. Also, just some general other things that you can do for kind of building the ecosystem part of your forest garden or food forest is one is if you're looking to plant other native trees. Some of the best ones to have are stuff in the oak family, the poplar family, the willow family, and the prunus family. So those 4 families are the plant families, the native plant families that harbor the highest number, like by a wide margin, the highest numbers of native insects. And so what that's useful for is those native insects are then food for the frogs and the dragonflies and the birds and all these other native things that you want around, so that if a pest is attacking your thing, they're around to then attack your pest too. And so they provide food the rest of the year so that those beneficial organisms are close by when you need them. Also, having a water source is very helpful for wildlife, insects, and otherwise. And we're going to talk about the aquatic layer. This water source can also be a place for you to grow food. It can have multiple purposes, and we'll talk about how to do that. Also, having things like bird houses, including there's owl houses, which I just learned a couple years ago, which is really cool because owls kill literally hundreds of rodents, which is awesome. And bat boxes all support beneficial birds and bats. A really big one that I know is a controversial opinion for some people, but is keeping cats inside. I love this little chart over here of what kills birds. I always pull this up anytime someone's like, we can't have wind turbines, it's bad for birds. I'm like, have you met cats? So, wind turbines, which people talk about, they estimate kill about 300,000 birds a year. Cats kill 1.8 billion. So I don't think it's the wind turbines causing catastrophic bird declines. So keeping cats inside, especially like keeping them out of the area that you're trying to attract birds to, might, be a good idea. Reducing light pollution at night is really helpful for supporting firefly populations, lightning bug populations, which are actually really good predatory insects, especially their larval forms, eat lots of pests. And so reducing light pollution at night helps them to find each other. That's the flashing, where you see some in the grass and some in the air. The males fly around, the females are in the grass. When there's lots of ambient light at night, the males can't find the females. They don't breed, the populations drop. So having fewer lights at night can be really helpful for your ecosystem. Also, leaving stems of your natives and not just over the winter. This is a thing that they're doing research on, but actually you can cut them. So kind of cut them, short, maybe 6 to 8 inches tall, and then just leaving those, because a lot of bees especially will overwinter in those stems. Like they'll actually lay eggs and the larva will hatch. The larva will overwinter, but they're not out of it by the time April comes around. So if you spend the time to like leave those stems up and then you cut them down in April, you're still actually killing a lot of bees, unfortunately. They're finding. So just cutting it back, and then as the new growth comes up, it's going to cover all those dead stems that are the dead stem stumps that are left. So you're not gonna really notice them, and they'll naturally decay by the fall, which is when the bees and stuff are actually leaving. Also leaving your leaves. So leaving kind of mulchy areas, you can rake them all up and throw them on a bed. You don't need to just leave them all over your yard, but leaving some of that litter cover on the ground is another great overwintering spot for beneficial insects. And also, this sounds crazy, but leaving some bare soil patches. A lot of our native bees actually live in the ground, and they need bare soil to be able to get into the ground. And so having some areas that are not mulched is also helpful. And then mulching is helpful for suppressing weeds, and providing that habitat for other insects. So basically have a diversity of stuff. All right. So then thinking of those things, how are you actually, designing it? And I promise we're going to get to the lists here soon. Mega map. At heart, I'm a geographer. And so my solution is always to make a map. But in this instance, I really do think it is absolutely the best way. Even if you're not a geographer, your map doesn't need to be fancy. It doesn't need to be to scale even, although that helps. You can just sketch it out. It can just help your brain start to think about how much space do I actually have? When I have this list of all these things I want to grow, and you actually start drawing circles on a map, you pretty quickly start realizing how much space you actually have. And that can be really helpful to help you to prioritize things so that you don't just start buying a bunch of stuff and then you're like, oh my gosh, I don't have space for this. And then you're planting stuff too close and then there's too much shade and then nothing's happy and it's not a good situation. We've all been there. So when you're making this map, your map should start out by adding anything, drawing anything on it that is not going away. So whether, if it's in your yard, that probably includes your house, I would assume. Things like a driveway, utilities, any established trees or plants that you're not going to remove. And then also put on the plan anything that you plan on adding. So whether that's, a sidewalk or a shed or a patio, even if it's not imminently in the plans, if you're like, oh, I really want to have a patio someday, make sure that's on there so that you don't plant a bunch of trees there and then you can never do that patio that you wanted. And then start adding plants from your list, the list that you were making from your 7 layers. Start kind of drawing those on there from the top down. So what I mean by that is, draw the canopy on there first, because then that's going to show you, oh, well, I've got this big tree here. So that means the next layer down, if it's, needs sun, I'm going to need to have it on the south side of this, or whatever. And so start from the top down. And make sure for appropriate spacing. So, you plant stuff too close and you end up with weird situations like this and a lot of shade. So again, make sure to stick with that kind of 1.5 times spacing on your plants. And then what do you actually plant? So as I said, start from the top down. We're going to go through the list from the top down. So for the canopy, there's lots of great options. Chestnuts are great if you have good soil for it. So chestnuts need a little bit of an acidic soil, a little more acidic than most of our soils around here. So if you really want to do chestnuts, it's worth doing a quick pH test of your soil. If you're going to do chestnuts, you want to do the Chinese chestnut. The European and American chestnuts all die here because there's a disease that was introduced from China over 100 years ago. So the Chinese chestnut is really the only one that is dependable here. Pecans will also grow here, despite what our general society seems to say about pecans. They're from here. The indigenous people of St. Louis farmed pecans. They will grow here. You just need to get northern cultivars. So buy them from a nursery that is in the north, or look up cultivars for the north and then plant those from wherever you can find them. But you don't want to be planting, pecans for Georgia or Texas. Like, you do want ones that are for our area. So just look up northern pecans and get those. Hickories. So pecans are actually a type of hickory, but there are other edible hickories. So you can do those. And then there's hickons, which are hybrids between hickories and pecans. Those are usually considered really, really good, but they don't produce as reliably, is my understanding, but they're really delicious. This one, the next couple are going to sound a little weird, but maples. So, and the reason that these are on the list is that you can make maple syrup from maples, or you can just drink the sap. And we have a whole class that we did about that earlier this year that's up on our YouTube. If you want to learn about, how to get sap, what to do with sap, all those different things, you can check out our YouTube for that. But that includes sugar, maple, red maple, silver maple, and even box elder. Although I don't know who's planting a box elder, but if you got one, you can use it. And then river birch can be used for the same thing. You can make syrup from the sap. You can drink the sap. Black walnuts, you can also consume the sap from. Any of the cultivars are good for sap. If you're wanting to grow them for nuts, Mizzou has released some cultivars that I would recommend that you can get from Forest Keeling, which is a nursery here in Missouri. American persimmons are another one. So they all grow well here. Basically, all of the American persimmon cultivars are derived from a cultivar that was found growing in a fence row in Alton, Illinois. So they pretty much all grow great in our climate. But Prok, Prok, is one that we plant a lot, but there's a lot of them, and they all do fine. Another one that's a little odd is Norway spruce. I mean, really any spruce, but Norway spruce is the spruce that grows the best. If you're wanting like an evergreen, the tips of the spruce in spring when they're growing, they're kind of like a lime green color, are edible and have a really nice, bright flavor to them. So if you're wanting an evergreen anyways, that's one that you can grow and also get some food. And then heart nut should just have one R there. So this is actually a type of Japanese walnut. So it's more of like a classic walnut flavor, much easier to crack than the black walnut, and does seem to grow pretty well here. I don't have any specific cultivar recommendations. We haven't grown them really at all here. Like personally, I have not grown them, so I don't have specific cultivar recommendations. But they are growing in the region, and they seem to do well. And then kind of the small tree, so kind of the next layer down. So some non-standard ones would be the snowbell tree. So this is a native tree that gets really pretty flowers in the spring, white kind of bell-shaped flowers, which is why they're called snowbells. What's edible about them is pretty unique from a tree standpoint. And then it's after the flower is pollinated, it starts producing this little green thing that eventually turns into this brown, papery, just seed husk. But if you pick them when they're small and green like this, they're crunchy and taste exactly like cucumbers. So there is like a couple week period in the spring that you can pick those off, and it's like a tree cucumber. I've never tried pickling them, but probably work. Maybe you can make some tree pickles. I don't know. But those are snowbell trees. And then service berries. So most service berries are kind of in this small tree range of height. There's lots of different ones. They're all good. Mulberry is another one that you can grow. I like the shrubby ones better, but there are tree forms that you can get produce a fruit that I think is pretty good. The wild ones are hit or miss. Some of the wild ones are really bland. Some of them are really good. But if you're going to plant one for your food forest, get a named cultivar so that you know that the fruit is going to be delicious. And another one that's a little unique would be trees that have edible leaves. So mulberries, basswoods, also called lindens, and beech all have edible leaves when they're young. And they're edible as they get bigger too, but they get more tough. So pollarding is just where you cut the tree short so that you get kind of that regrowth. And then you can reach the leaves and pick them. Those are all edible. Also, the small tree range is where pretty much all of the conventional like fruit, like stuff that you would plant in an orchard, is going to fit. So that would be apples, Asian pears, European pears, peaches, pawpaws, jujubes, which is this here on the left, which is a tree that the fruit is kind of like it kind of tastes like an apple, has kind of the texture of an apple, but they are really, really sweet. And you can also cut them up and dry them, and they're used similarly to dates. So the non-American persimmons, so there's an Asian persimmon, and then there's a few cultivars that are hybrids between the Asian and the Native American one. So these stay smaller. So these would be in the small tree range. And then chayfruit, which is a Chinese species that's related actually to Osage orange or hedge apple, which is a native tree we have here, that it stays small and it gets little red round fruit on it that I don't really know how to explain it. It's a good fruit, at least in my opinion. It's a good fruit, but it doesn't really taste like anything else. Like it's unique, in my opinion. A quick note on the pawpaw that I want to just, rip off a Band-Aid here. They will grow in the shade. They are not going to produce very much fruit in the shade. Everyone talks about, oh, pawpaws are great for a forest garden because they grow in the shade. And yes, the trees grow in the shade. But if you go into the woods where pawpaws are in a lot of shade and look around, you don't find that many fruit. That is not just a genetic thing. That's because they're in the shade. So if you want a lot of fruit on your pawpaw, you need to be treating them just like you would an apple or a peach or a pear, and making sure that they're getting a good amount of sun. And then we have classes that are just on fruit trees too. So if you need any more specific information about those kind of common orchard plants, we got that covered for you. Edible shrubs are some of my favorites and ones that I think are really underappreciated and underthought about. Bush cherries are great. The Romance series is our favorite. So these are things like Carmine Jewel, Juliet, Romeo. What's the other one? There's another one that just came out. It's got like a French name that I can't remember. But they get these little fruit that are kind of like a mild tart cherry. And you can get a lot of food from them. I have 3 bushes, and I made like a gallon of pulp that we're gonna, I don't know, do something with. It's frozen right now. There's also shrubs form service berries, which are nice. Regent is one that does pretty well for us. There's also shrub form mulberry called Giraldi or Gerardi. It's spelled 2 different ways, but it's the same one. Chokeberries are not like a real delicious one, but they're very nutritious and have a good flavor if you use them like in baking. They are also called aronia berries. Rugosa rose. So this is an Asian rose species, I think Japanese, that gets these big old hips on them that are edible. Cornelian cherry is actually a dogwood that is a shrub that gets kind of oblong fruit on them that you would use similarly to a pie cherry. Hardy orange. This is like, yes, literally a citrus that grows here. This was a picture I took of one that's growing in Bellefontaine Cemetery. I grow them in my orchard as well. They have wicked thorns. And so they're not the most fun plant, but they look really cool. And you don't use them like an orange, you use them like a lemon. You do get some juice from them. You can juice them and use that juice as you would lemon in cooking. Hazelnuts do well. These are some of my hazelnuts here in the bottom right. You want the hybrids, so not the American hazelnut, not the European hazelnut, but the European American hybrids are the ones that seem to do the best. The pure American hazelnut grows well here, but its yields are lower. The European hazelnut, generally speaking, does not survive here because we have a disease that our native hazelnut is pretty much immune to, but the European is not. And so it eventually gets that disease and dies. Elderberries are also good. The American cultivars are the ones that I would recommend. So these are mostly ones that have been released by the University of Missouri. And then figs can be grown here. And figs fit into this shrub category in our climate, not as a tree, although they're talked about as trees. And in the Mediterranean, they are trees. Here they are shrubs because they die down to the ground in the winter and then regrow. So they are a multi-stemmed shrub, and that's fine. They can die down every winter and they will still grow back and produce fruit. And Chicago Hardy is the one that is the most reliable, that is also easy to find. There's a couple other ones that work here, but they're hard to find. So Chicago Hardy, though, very dependable. Oh, and I did also want to mention, at least the bush cherry, we have found to be relatively shade tolerant. Like you can put them on the east side. Like we have some on the east side of a really tall building. So they're only getting like pretty early morning sun and they are still producing fruit, which is pretty unusual for fruiting things. So that's another one that you can kind of stick in. Doesn't need to be right on the south side. You can kind of push over to the sides a little bit into areas that are a little more shady, and they do pretty well. And hazelnuts can take a little bit of shade as well. The more shade you give hazelnuts, the less they produce, but they can take quite a bit of shade. And then there are ones that are good just for shade. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but the ribes family, so these are currants, gooseberries, and jostaberries. really need afternoon shade here, in my experience. They can grow in pretty deep shade, but you get the most fruit in a planting them kind of on the east side of things, so that they still get a fair amount of sun in the morning when it's cool. You get kind of the most fruit that way. So these are fruit that are not super common in the US. They have a really good flavor, but most people don't like them just like as fresh eating fruit. They do have kind of a stronger flavor, but I like them fresh, but most people do not. But they are a really good baking or cooking fruit. They're used a lot to make like jams, jellies, pies, cobblers, things like that. They're really good for them. Really good flavor. And then honey berries. And the real claim to fame of honeyberries is that they ripen really early, like mid to end of May, which is really early for fruit. So that's really kind of where they excel at. They get little blue oblong fruit on them that are kind of like a blueberry, but they tend to be more tart than a blueberry. The blue series is the one that I have the most experience with. So there's a lot of them that are called like Blue Moon, Blue Forest, Blue Pagoda, like all those different things. And I've had pretty good luck with those. I've tried some of the other ones and had spotty luck, but I'm sure other ones do well, as well, as long as you give them a fair amount of, especially afternoon shade. Then there's also the cane fruit. So these kind of straddle the line between shrubs and herbaceous things. But these would be blackberries, raspberries, and black raspberries, which are different from blackberries. For blackberries, I would pick any of the thornless ones. There's thornless ones now. The thorny ones it's just not worth it. If you have ever dealt with thorny blackberries, you know what I'm talking about. For raspberries, I like Joan J, and then any of the everbearing or fall bearing ones. And then for black raspberry, I like one called Niwot, which is actually an everbearing but a black raspberry. And if you haven't had a black raspberry, you're missing out. It's a native raspberry that's black, amazing flavor, and they usually ripen right around the summer solstice. It's like that's usually when I go pick them, is on the solstice, because that's when I remember, and they're always there. And then there's edible vines. So maypop. So this is actually a native passion fruit. So it gets these gorgeous, gorgeous flowers that bumblebees go crazy for. And they get these weird fruit that like shrivel up and look like they're rotting, and they fall off, and they look really gross. But the insides look like this. But this is what passion fruits look like. And it's this like sack of fruit jelly stuff around it. That is actually what passion fruit is. And it tastes just like passion fruit. So if you like passion fruit, there's a native one for you. This is a unique one in that it is not woody, so it dies down to the ground every winter and grows back, but it does spread very aggressively. So I generally like to have it somewhere where I'm going to be mowing around it, which prevents it from going crazy. The mowing keeps it down. You can also grow grapes. I would recommend seeded grapes. The seedless ones tend to have a lot more diseases than the seedless ones have a lot more diseases than the seeded ones. There's also not native. There is a kiwi that you can grow here that is hardy in our climate. Any of the hardy kiwis seem to do okay here. Anna and Meader, Meader, are the two that we plant most commonly for the females. And hardy kiwis are unique in the fruit world in that there are females that produce fruit, and you need a male that does not produce fruit planted as well. So you are going to need at least 2 vines, and one of those vines is not going to produce you fruit. So you do need to make sure when you buy a hardy kiwi that you're also buying a pollinator, a male pollinator to go with it. You can grow hops if you want to, do some brewing. And then there's another interesting fruit called Schisandra that I have not actually harvested berries from, but I have been growing a vine for a while. It's planted in a spot that isn't really good for it, and so it hasn't produced fruit yet. But it does grow every year, and it's looks pretty. But it gets these big clusters of fruit that are, I hear, good. And then the herbaceous layer. So this is really where we're getting into like more perennial vegetables, herbs, things like that. So the herbaceous layer would be things like sage, does great. Mountain mint is a native plant we have that is basically a clumping mint. So it doesn't go everywhere crazy like most mints that you think about, but it does taste like mint. There's also two cultivars of blackberries and raspberries that I would put into this category just because they stay so short, like 18 inches tall, really small. And that would be a raspberry called shortcake and a blackberry called baby cakes that stay nice and small. There's also, believe it or not, a ginger that you can grow here that is perennial. It's from Japan originally, called miyoga, and it is not the root that you are eating. It produces this nice, pretty clumping foliage that can take quite a bit of shade. I have it planted right underneath my apple tree, but it produces these weird little flower buds that pop up out of the ground in like July, and then for a couple months, those will keep popping up, and you cut that off, and it's like this little green bulb thing that tastes kind of like ginger. So it's kind of like a green onion is to an onion is what miyoga ginger is to ginger. So it's kind of like a green ginger is kind of the idea. And then there's a plant called scorzonera. So this is actually sold as an annual vegetable. It's a root crop, but if you don't harvest that root crop, if you don't pull it out of the ground, it's actually a perennial, and the leaves are pretty good. They're very mild. They're nice in salads and stuff like that, and they'll keep growing for several years for you. There's also in the herbaceous layer, all of the onion family is a great perennial vegetable to have in your forest garden. You can get chives, you can get garlic chives, which are that's what this is here. They have flat leaves, they have more of a garlicky flavor. You can plant garlic and elephant garlic as perennials. I have around all of my fruit trees, I have garlic and elephant garlic planted. And if you stick one in the ground and you don't harvest it, the next year you have a clump. And then instead of harvesting the bulb, you harvest the green shoots and you eat just like, it's like green garlic or, basically. So again, kind of a green onion is to an onion is kind of what this green garlic is to garlic. And you can just, from the clump, you can cut off all but one of them if you wanted to and eat them. And then that one will again just kind of multiply after it produces a bulb, and you'll just keep going. There's walking onions, which are incredibly prolific. This was my haul from just cleaning out the ones that just produced their own, like that I didn't plant, that just spread on their own this year in my my annual vegetable garden. I actually chopped all these up and dried them and got like a gallon of onion powder from it. And then there's a plant called potato onions, which is kind of a self-multiplying perennial, like bulb onion, but it's a small bulb, like, just about yay big. I know I'm running at time here, but we got the perennial vegetables. Also in the herbaceous layer, I would say you can plant any annual vegetable if you want. Just make sure, your annual vegetables need quite a bit of sun. So you would need it to be a pretty sunny patch if you're wanting to do annual vegetables in kind of your forest garden area. But some of the ones that are perennials that I really like are hostas. So this is one that I would say, actually stay tuned. We did a mass hosta tasting. We tasted about 100 cultivars from a woman that we were able to connect with through the St. Louis Hosta Society. And from that, we were able to generate a list of which ones were not good and which ones were really good. And we got a list of, I think it's about 20 cultivars that I would plant right now purely as a vegetable, that were really good. The main thing you're eating is the shoot that comes up in the spring. This is a particularly large cultivar that we harvested. So you can see it's a pretty hefty vegetable for early spring. But you can also see from this picture down here, if they're open a little bit, that's fine. They're not poisonous. You can eat any of them, but some of them are not good. And some of them are really good. So we have that. Also, daylilies. Believe it or not, daylilies were originally cultivated as food. All parts of a daylily are edible, and we're specifically talking about the old orange ones that a lot of the daylily people like to look down upon. But these orange ones, you can eat the whole things. I particularly like in the spring the early leafy shoots coming up out of the ground. They're very mild. There's not a lot else to eat at that time of year. And then also right now, the flower buds before they open, you can pop those off and kind of stir fry them, and they have kind of a meaty, earthy, musty flavor that's pretty good. Or when they're open like this, you can kind of stuff them and use them like you would a squash blossom, which is pretty good. Anise hyssop is a native that's in the mint family. It has kind of an anise flavor, and that's the leaves, but this is it down here. It's also just a gorgeous flower. Asparagus, sorrel, which is a perennial leafy green. Horseradish, which I put on here. Usually we think about the root of horseradish, but you can also eat the leaves, and the leaves taste like horseradish. So you can plant it, stick it somewhere around a tree or something, let it grow. This is what I do. I have, a big patch of it planted around a cherry tree. And in the spring, I go around and I harvest leaves and chop them up, put them in salads, stir fry them, and you get kind of a nice horseradishy flavor. Lemongrass is an annual here, but will grow kind of in the sunnier areas that you have. And then there is actually a perennial kale. You grow it from seed from a company called Experimental Farm Network, which has a lot of interesting plants for seeds that you can try in forest gardens. But they have this one perennial kale that I planted. I think I planted like 100 of them and stuck them all out. And it was about 10 of them overwintered. And then I collected seed from them and planted them. And now like most of them are perennial at this point. And so there are some perennial kales out there. You're going to lose some, but some of them will survive. And then a couple other really good ones. There is a perennial arugula that I really love. We actually sold it this year at our summer sale, and we'll probably do that again next year. But you can also find seed and grow your own. It looks just like the annual arugula, except the leaves are a little smaller. The leaves are a little tougher. And so it's good for like wilting, they can handle cooking in a way that annual arugula can't. And they'll produce flowers, they'll go to seed, but then they'll just produce leaves again. There's also, this is another one that you can get from Experimental Farm Network, which is called Dietrich's Wild Broccoli Rabe. And this is one here that you can see just looks like a big weedy thing. It's surrounded by grass that I stuck in and forgot was there. Like I stuck it in last spring. And then this spring, this is one plant. I got like handfuls of little broccoli rabe florets in like March. Like they're very, very early producing. And then sea kale, which is a perennial relative of kale and broccoli. And you can eat the leaves when they're young, but what I really like them for is, again, the flower buds. So this is a harvest that I got from one day. It's harvest from a patch that I have. So it's all these little heads of broccoli that I put together to get kind of like one big head. And it also has beautiful flowers in the summer. For the ground cover layer, strawberries are a really good ground cover. Any of the mints, and there's dozens of types of mints with different flavors. Thyme, oregano, and then a weird one, wild violets, which I'm not necessarily recommending you plant wild violets, although you could, but they are native, they are perennial, they are edible, and they are good. The leaves are edible and very mild, pretty tender, even as we go into the summer. They don't get super tough, and the flowers are also edible, which is nice. And again, I'm talking about the wild violets that grow in lawns, not the African violet, which is not a violet and is poisonous. So these are like the wild weedy violets is what I'm talking about here. And then kind of a grab bag of like weird ones. If you have kind of a rocky area that you're looking to plant some things, there is a native prickly pear cactus, which does have really pretty flowers, and the pads are edible. You need to strip the spines, and it's quite a process, but if you really want to do it, you can do it. And then crocus. If you like crocuses, saffron is a fall blooming crocus, and it will grow here. It does need pretty good drainage, so it would be a good thing to kind of plant in a berm or a raised area in your forest garden. But this is what they look like. They're gorgeous, and they bloom in October. So pollinators do really like them because there's not a whole lot else blooming at that time. So they will come in and feed on the saffron. And then the aquatic layer. I just did want to quickly bring this up because it sounds like such a weird thing to do. But we have done it at our demonstration garden for a couple of years, and I'm always surprised at how much wildlife it brings around. it can be really beneficial for wildlife, and you can see a lot of diversity from like a kiddie pool, like really small amounts of water. Um, so, like we grew, you can grow water chestnuts, you can grow water lotus, sweet potato vines will actually grow in flooded conditions, which I did not know. And then you can eat the leaves. You can also grow rice, but really the one that, like, if you're looking for food, water chestnuts is really what I have, is really what I've gravitated towards. They produce a lot. They're very easy to produce. Um, they're not hard, like, or complicated to grow in any way. You don't need any special tools. So water chestnuts is really the main one that I recommend to people for flooded areas. And I really like kiddie pools, especially for water chestnuts. They do really well. And just doing something as simple as, having a kiddie pool, filling it up with dirt, flooding it with water, sticking some water chestnuts in there produces a lot of ecological benefits. It's a place, this is a different thing, but we would come in there and regularly find birds like bathing in it and drinking from it. Um, there's this picture down here. We had a frog lay a bunch of eggs, and we had like a whole group of tadpoles living in one year. There's always dragonflies flying around it, and these are all good things to have around. Um, and it doesn't take very long. Like I literally set up our water chestnut little pool today in about 20 minutes. Like filled it up with dirt. It was like one wheelbarrow full. Plot, like you then flood it, at which point like you don't even have to like dig holes. Like you literally just take it and just like push it into the dirt. And it grows. And then just when the water is not flooded anymore, add more water. That's literally the whole process to grow them. And then you have this like nice water feature. And I'll say I don't necessarily know why. We have never had a mosquito issue doing this. There are little granules that you can get to stick in the water that will kill mosquito larvae, but not beneficial insects. We bought that the first year we did this thinking we were going to need them, and we just haven't needed them. But that's not to say that you won't have that problem. But I've been surprised at how much of an issue that has not been for us. So, consider an aquatic layer. And then lastly, the fungal layer. So you can also grow mushrooms, and forest areas are a great place to do this, partially because there tends to be a lot of mulched areas. You add some wood chip mulch around your perennials, and you can inoculate King Strophoria. We sell those in the spring. They're really easy to grow. We have instructions online about how to do that. And that's what these are down here. These are a little past prime, but they're growing in here around some garlic chives that are growing around the base of our apple. You can also inoculate them on old logs. Like we stacked some logs here, and in between, like in this cut, we just packed a bunch of spawn, and we got these like huge oyster mushrooms coming off of it. So lastly, is just some additional resources. So these are just some of my favorite books that talk about food forests that have really good lists, really well researched. This one over here, if you like really want to dive deep, the Edible Forest Gardens book, it's a 2-volume set, is really good. Goes into like an absurd amount of detail, has a really detail, like I think half of the second volume is like appendices of like tables and charts and like plant lists and like all these different things. Really, really good information in these books if you want to dive some more. And then the Creating a Forest Garden by Martin Crawford. So Martin Crawford runs one of the oldest forest gardens that has like, it's like a modern forest garden. It's in the UK. So he has a lot of experience. He's written quite a few books, but I really like this Creating a Forest Garden book. It has a lot of really practical information in it. And just as a like addendum to any resources that you get, though, is it's really important to know where the recommendations are from. And I specifically am mentioning that about Martin Crawford's stuff. So Creating a Forest Garden and How to Grow Perennial Vegetables. He is in the UK, which has a much more mild climate than we do. And so there are quite a few perennials in this book that are not perennials here. So the information is really good, but you do need to be aware of like, where is this coming from? How does it compare to where we are? And just, verify that if it's a person that's, from an area very different than we are. And that is the end. I hope that was helpful to everybody. And thank you so much for coming.